Alright, everyone. No intro today. So, you know what that means. I am back once again with another emotionally devastating topic. A little while ago, I made a video talking about the responses to a Tumblr poll asking folks if kink is always sexual or not. Vanilla folks came out of the woodwork to declare that kink is implicitly always sexual, and if you say it's not, you are a liar. If you think what you're doing is non-sexual kink, you are trying to forcibly change the definition of what kink is, and the dictionary says you are wrong. Just call what you're doing a special interest or a hobby. Be honest about it and stop being so sex negative. Yeah, if all of that wasn't bad enough, there was an additional part to that story I did not get to cover at the time. There was a particularly malicious claim that promoting non-sexual kink being possible makes you a dangerous child predator. And this is what I want to focus on addressing today, because I believe the sentiment underlying this claim is not just isolated to Tumblr. So, what I really like to be able to say is that this only came from one person, and it's kind of concerning, but not really part of a larger trend. But it was actually somewhat common. Amongst the more ardent, no non-sexual kink folks, this is where the conversation would eventually end up. The accusation that if you are saying kink can be non-sexual for anyone at all ever, you are a danger to children and should not ever be around them. And they were not beating around the bush with this opinion. As one user put it, genuinely harrowing to see that over 24,000 people seem to think kink can be non-sexual. You mother effers should not be within 1,000 feet of a child. And this reaction seems a little extreme, right? Like, I'm not even saying by normal real-life standards, but internet standards even, like, this seems pretty intense. And I wondered where on earth all of this vitriol could be coming from. So when I dug further into the replies and reblogs under the poll, I started to find an answer. One discussion went like this. Yes, kink is always sexual, and I think if you voted no, you are objectively wrong and might be buying into some well-intentioned but harmful rhetoric. I wondered what kind of harmful rhetoric we could be talking about here. Well, the worst kind imaginable, of course, as another user clarified in response. And also, I think you don't remember the 2010s when ace adults were quite frequently running around non-sexually, entering into inappropriate queer platonic relationships with minors and sharing and indulging in their non-sexual kinks with said minors. Kink is sexual. If you are experiencing physical and emotional arousal because of kink, that is sexual arousal. It doesn't mean you are not asexual. Plenty of ace people experience sexual feelings, and it is both okay and normal to be one of those ace people. So thanks for the asexual validation at the end there, I guess, but what the heck? Because I was on Tumblr in the 2010s as an ace kinky person, and I have zero memory of this happening. Do any of you all watching right now remember this happening? Because what I mostly recall at that time is people fighting over the use of hashtags and violating DNI requests. Like, there was that time when the Lolita community got really upset at the ABDL and DDLG communities for reposting or using photos from Lolita brands or from creators or from their blogs, even when the ABDL or DDLG blogs did not feature any kind of explicitly kinky content and were just aesthetic accounts. Then there was when minors got really mad. We told them they couldn't do kink yet, so they invented safe for work pet regression and pretended that their 30-year-old internet caregiver was definitely not a weird, icky, bad BDSM dom like we have. They were actually just helping them heal from their trauma. That is what I remember happening on Tumblr from around that time. So, yeah. But just to say it, so there is no ambiguity for anyone watching, I think it is inappropriate for an adult, asexual, aromantic, or otherwise, to be in a relationship with a minor. If it's sexual, if it's non-sexual, if it's kinky, if it's vanilla, if it's queer platonic, I don't care. None of those things are okay. We have control over what we do as adult people. It's really not that hard to avoid dating a minor if you're halfway diligent about it. And no, I'm not talking about weird edge cases where it's like, but what if they're 18 and 17 and they're dating and then the person turns 18 while they're dating? They're technically adult. What does that mean? Like, no, we're not going to play that game, all right? I'm talking about when people who are into adulthood are trying to get into relationships with people who they know are much younger than them. At the same time, I do have to admit I find it troubling that the conclusion we are supposed to draw from all of this is that it's a dangerous lie to say kink can ever be non-sexual for anyone ever, because if we say that, it will enable predators to target kids on the internet? Is that really the rhetoric we want to go with here? I guess it is, with all the people making a "but would you do kink with a minor gotcha" attempt on the back of this, because in their eyes, you have to say yes to that question if you think kink can be non-sexual, and if you say no, you are admitting that kink is exclusively a sex thing, and that's why adults shouldn't do it with children. As several astute viewers of mine have already pointed out, there are lots of things we don't do with minors that are not sex things. So this argument to me does not hold water. We don't give minors drugs or alcohol. We don't give them the keys to a sports car at 14. Heck, if you want a real hot take, dating a minor is still wrong, even if you don't do anything sexual with them. Call me whatever you like, but that's my opinion and I'm going to stick to it. I think that's where my morality is. Honestly, even though I think their opinions are misguided, I might have some respect for this side of the argument if they had stopped at, well, we can't say it can be non-sexual because that gives cover to predators. I think there's a good intention there, but that is not where things stopped, because this quickly transformed, as it often does, from that into just, I think people who say kink can be non-sexual are probably predators themselves. Remember that quote from earlier, the one that said we shouldn't be within 1,000 feet of a child? They were serious about that one. As evidence for this conclusion, one user said, quote, "I had a conversation with someone about their practice of non-sexual BDSM. Turns out they were on the sex offender registry because they solicited nudes from a minor and participated in non-sexual kink with them. It's a fairly common way that PDF files on Tumblr solicit interactions with minors. There was a blog that had an inflation kink Discord that welcomed minors because they claimed it was non-sexual because they were ace." I suspect this blog is what the previous story was referring to when they claimed that ace adults in the 2010s were running around everywhere engaging in kink with minors. Maybe this is just me, but I feel like it would be incredibly disingenuous if this all were because of one user a decade ago was doing something wrong. It would definitely be a stretch to generalize something to the entire population of self-identified non-sexual kinksters because of one guy. Like, remember the context of this whole conversation. A popular Tumblr blog posted a poll, and tens of thousands of people responded to it. I saw dozens, if not hundreds, of non-sexual kinksters trying to explain their positions. But we can't listen to what their lived experiences are because one time, a dude who used the same label as them did something wrong. Gosh, where have I heard that kind of rhetoric before? Are Tumblr zillennials taking notes from Blair White now? Because let's not forget, the majority of the people with the strongest ire for non-sexual kinksters are young queer and trans people themselves. And somehow, they got all the way to saying, one of you is dangerous, so all of you are inherently dangerous, without realizing the deep, rich irony at play here. So, let's talk about the elephant in the room. All of this has a distinctly queerphobic and transphobic flavor to it, doesn't it? If I scrubbed out all of the kink references and made this story about a trans woman or a gay man, I think we would instantly see this. If you heard someone say, I had a conversation with someone about their practice of transgenderism, turns out they were on the sex offender registry because they solicited nudes from a minor and were trying to teach them how to be trans. I mean, if you heard that, you would instantly be like, that's a hell of a claim to make without literally any evidence, especially because you are using this point to try and prove all trans women are predatory monsters who shouldn't be around children. And I can already hear the opposition to my making this comparison, even from people who generally agree with what I'm saying. So allow me to explain for a moment. I know the knee-jerk reaction to hearing this is going to be, for some people, how dare you make a comparison between being trans and being kinky? Those two are not the same at all. And if you are one of these people, please, if you're not already, take a seat, because I have another spicy, spicy hot take for you. So, I am old now, officially. I am old enough to remember the fight for marriage equality, though I wasn't quite old enough yet then to be politically active. The narrative that I remember hearing was that marriage equality should be allowed because gay people can't help it. They're born this way. Especially from straight folks, it seemed very patronizing. But one of the consequences of this advocacy has been, I believe, over time, an over-focus on being born this way as the only valid way for an identity to be an identity. As someone who believes that sexuality and even gender identity can be fluid and changing over time for some people, this leaves out a lot of folk who do not feel like their identity has been the same since they were born, but still feel like what they're experiencing is part of their identity nonetheless. It somehow became a hard and fast rule that in order to say you are queer or trans or anything else, it has to be something you have always been. I've always known since I was 2 years old that I wanted to be a girl, that kind of thing. And more than that, I'm seeing it being increasingly used to tell people that, well, you can't really be suffering because you're making a choice. That's totally different from something that you just are. People who are polyamorous or kinky or whatever are just making lifestyle choices. Those things can't be part of your identity. What do you want to do? Make it the LGBTQIAKP plus community? Give me a break. And I swear, I'm not trying to do a does being kinky make you queer video right now because that is a whole other can of worms, but look, there's no reason on earth why every marginalized aspect of who we are has to be shoved under the LGBT umbrella like that's the only way identity can be experienced. I'm not sure why we decided that when people say, I'm kinky and this is important to who I am, what they are asking for is to have a K added to LGBT+. I do think that being kinky is different from the experience of being trans, but I also think that being gay is different from being trans, and being asexual is different from being aromantic. I'm not sure I get the utility behind trying to compare all of these things and have them compete in some kind of oppression Olympics where only the most unchangeable and most oppressed get to be validated. And I actually think this is why people feel pressure to say what they're experiencing is an unalterable aspect of who they are, because it's the only way to have people be willing to defend you, the only way to get sympathy and respect in all directions, from queer people, from cishet people, from friends and family, just across the board. There is a sense that, being mean and discriminating against people is okay, unless it's something they can't change about themselves. Then it's off limits, and only then. That doesn't seem like a good way to go about things. And for the record, I do think that there are kinky people and polyamorous folks who experience that as being an immutable characteristic. And I think there are also folk who have a much more relaxed relationship with those things where it's more of a fun add-on or relationship style choice. Both perspectives are okay. This is why I feel comfortable making a comparison between queer and transphobia and bias against kinky people and polyamorous people. No, they are not on the same level. They don't always have the same consequences either, but people can carry a deep bias, even hatred, for those who are kinky or polyamorous, not just because of what they do, but because of who they are. And the line between what you do and who you are is sometimes a lot blurrier than some people would like to believe. And for people who are phobic, that line is especially blurry. So, to tie this all back around to what we were just discussing, this is part of why I find it so mind-numbing when people argue about other people's lived experiences, talking over them to say, no, sweetie, you can't actually be that thing. Read a dictionary, because our lives are complicated. What makes up an identity is complicated. What does it cost you just to listen, just to believe someone when they say they know who they are better than you? Instead of building community and seeking understanding, we end up arguing and going in circles. Is it really so hard to believe that in a world of several billion people that say 0.5% of the population might be able to experience kink through a lens other than just sexual? For some people, it is that hard to imagine. Maybe they're just afraid, as I've been talking about, that if we admit that kink can be non-sexual as well as sexual, there's no reason for adults to not do kink with minors anymore. But is that even true? I don't think so. I've already mentioned that there are lots of non-sexual stuff that is inappropriate for minors to do, especially with adults. But beyond that, why shouldn't an adult and a minor do kinky stuff together if no sex is involved? Back in the 2010s on Instagram and Tumblr, it was frequently argued by minors that they should be allowed to do kink and be in adult spaces because they were mature for their age, that old timeless classic. They'd claim that because they were above the age of consent, or because they were already having sex anyway, what's the difference? So, first off, it is always a good idea to remind people that in most places, the age of consent is not what matters when it comes to doing kink with someone, but the age of majority. That is the age when you are considered to be an adult who can make decisions about their own body on their own, like with medical procedures or with getting a tattoo. In most places, this is about 18, and in several places in the Western world, it's even higher than this. Like, did you know that the age of majority is 19 in a few US states and Canadian provinces? Apparently it is. So if you are not yet able to consent to a piercing or tattoo without your parents being involved, you probably aren't ready to do BDSM. A lot of people will also bring up developmental maturity, particularly of the brain, when trying to explain why minors shouldn't do kink. When I was coming up in the scene, people usually repeated that your brain doesn't stop developing until you're 25, and kink can be harmful on developing brains, so don't mess with that, please. And, well, it turns out that that might be kind of a little bit of a lie. Like a lot of the popular neuropsych stats out there, it turns out this actually isn't really strictly speaking the case. As Slate reported in 2022, 18 to 21-year-olds had brain activity in the prefrontal cortices that looked more like that of younger teenagers than that of people over 21. Alexandra Cohen, the lead author of that study and now a neuroscientist at Emory University, said the scientific consensus is that brain development continues into people's 20s. But, she wrote in an email, I don't think there's anything magical about the age of 25. There's far from any consensus about any specific age that defines the boundary between adolescence and adulthood. Quote, I honestly don't know why people pick 25. The fact that neuroscientists themselves are puzzled why everyone got stuck on the age of 25 should be evidence enough that the claim is bunk. What is clear, though, from the research is that our brains are still developing in our teen years, often in very important ways. We're just not sure when it stops, or frankly, if it stops. And also, what pace our brains develop at is extremely individual. So I think it is valid to say that having a full-on MS power exchange relationship with an adult is probably a bad idea at 15. From a risk awareness perspective, we simply do not know what early experiences with kink might do to a young brain, even if they are otherwise consensual or with other teenagers. At the same time, I don't think we should change the minimum age to enter a dungeon to 25 out of a fear that 20-year-olds are just big teenagers. I don't really think there's any clear evidence that this is a marker of maximal possible brain development any more than 18 is. But lastly, I want to touch on the argument that if a young person is already having sex, there's no reason for them to not also engage in kink. Some people believe, if anything, kink is less risky than sex because, hey, spanking can't get you pregnant or give you an STI. But I am not sure that the activities are comparable enough that if you're doing one, you're automatically going to be prepared for the other. Depending on what you are doing, there may be some overlap, but not always. Knowing about oral is not going to prepare you for an electroplay scene. The main barriers to entry for good, healthy kink are the ability to communicate and to know and stick up for your boundaries. The fact is, when you are much younger and you have much less relationship experience overall, you are less likely to know what your boundaries are, what it feels like when someone pushes against them, and what to do if that happens. You might not have the confidence to ask for what you want or stick up for yourself. You might not have the self-knowledge to even know what you want in the first place. You might not have had the time to explore things independently. And in fact, especially if you are underage, you have almost no way to learn how to do these things properly outside of books and internet articles. That is one of the big reasons why adults and minors should not be doing kink together. There is a huge information asymmetry problem that cannot be rectified. If you cannot go to classes, if you can't go to munches or watch other people in a dungeon or reach out to people in your local community for help, then you may feel inclined to just take your older partner's word for it. After all, you have nothing else to go off of and no easy way to get resources to double check them. And you may not want to because that would be insulting. And don't you trust them? Community accountability can be very vital to creating a functional kink relationship, especially when you're new. And when you don't have that, when you can't have that, it can make things dangerous pretty quickly. If we're going off of the Fry's model, this makes truly informed consent functionally impossible. And also, sex doesn't have to be involved for things to go wrong. In fact, it's often the non-sexual things that can be much, much worse. Being told to ignore your body signals that you don't want to do a scene, being told to toughen up and not complain so much in rope, being told that all of the other masochists can take so much more pain than you can, that all real power exchange relationships don't have safe words, that you're a baby if you want aftercare, that as a submissive you aren't allowed to have an opinion. It's bad enough when something like this happens to someone well into adulthood, given how much it can permanently warp your perspective, but with someone who's still a kid, it's devastating on a whole other level. I would argue that this information asymmetry is what most predators are looking to exploit, that they want to have all of the power and make sure you have none, that you can't find a way to tell them no or tell them that they're wrong, because their egos are fragile and they cannot handle partners who know what to do without them. Blaming the concept of non-sexual kink for predatory behavior fundamentally misunderstands how predators work. They will do and say just about anything to get access to people who they wish to exploit, be that minors, or newbie subs, or neurodivergent people, or people with mental health issues. I've seen time and time again that predators latch on to whatever the next hot thing is to try and draw the attention of would-be victims. I've seen it happen with DDLG and ABDL. I've seen it happen with pet play and power exchange and pleasure dominance. They'll put on whatever label they need in order to look appealing, and they'll do their best to look innocent while doing it. They're one of the safe ones, they promise. Everyone else is bad and scary, and they wouldn't understand you. But they do, so trust them. They can guide you, teach you, help you. Don't worry. If they have to say it's non-sexual to get to you, they'll say that. If they have to say they're trans or asexual or queer or anything else to get to you, they will say that too. It doesn't mean anything about those labels in and of themselves. It means that predators are willing to put on whatever costume it takes to get to their prey of choice. And besides that, it's often part of predator MO to start with strictly non-sexual interactions to gain the trust of a victim or people around the victim, creating an illusion of just being friends, of being safe, then slowly shifting the direction of interactions to become more and more overtly sexual. In that case, non-sexual kink isn't part of a legitimate identity. It's a classic cover story. The fact people can look at this and go, so on one side we have a guy saying he does non-sexual kink to lure minors into a private chat room, and on the other, we have two consenting adults who both say they do non-sexual kink with each other. Those are totally the exact same thing, and they're all equally wrong and bad. It's so frustrating to me, like, the warning sign should have been adult invites minors into private group chat, not non-sexual kink. Like, are we really missing that? Come on. Like, am I losing my mind for thinking that? Because there is no reason for adults to be mixing socially with kids. I have never met a single person in the kink scene who thinks our doors should be open to minors. No one wants minors at their events. I've never met a kinkster, non-sexual otherwise, who advocates for adults to be able to openly play with kids. It just makes me sick that instead of focusing on actual predators, we're policing what people's internal worlds are allowed to look like out of fear. It is ridiculous. Even if we wipe the phrase non-sexual kink from the internet tomorrow, it still would not get rid of the bad actors. They would just find a new thing to latch onto. But what it would do is erase a pretty large subsection of the BDSM community who identify with playing non-sexually. And I will be the first to say that the BDSM community can have a real problem with predators. We don't always know how to handle it as a community. We don't have good tools for calling it out and making sure people know who the bad actors are. But the reality is, there is not a subsection of our community that doesn't have to deal with folks who want to exploit others. It happens in DS, it happens in rope bondage, and it also happens in sexually explicit play as well. In fact, if I had to run the numbers, I would bet more aggressive, dangerous tops are openly sexual with their play than those who claim their kink is totally non-sexual from the jump. At least all the worst players I can think of are people who are openly very sexual and tend to constantly try and insert sex into their scenes and interactions. They also tend to pursue pretty freaking young people. It's not universal, no, but it's not like the common denominator with predators that they claim to be asexual or that their kink is never sexual for them. Far from it. And just to really hammer home this point, I was going to cite a study showing that kinksters are not any more likely to be child predators than the general population. But that study doesn't exist. I've never even heard of it being theorized in literature. What I have seen time and time again is that studies show kinky folk are not any more mentally unwell than the general population, that interests in kinks like DDLG or CGL do not correlate with an attraction to children, and things along those lines. And putting those pieces of information together alongside my own experience, meeting probably thousands of kinksters at this point, I feel pretty confident saying that non-sexual kink is not the source of the problem. And it never was. Predators are just good at figuring out what to say and what is popular with their target population, and then finding ways to infiltrate that space where the potential victims can be found. I'm not really even sure what my main point for this video is. I don't think I can really convince people who think that non-sexual kink means you're a child predator, I think they're kind of lost. I'm not really going to be able to reach them. So I think I'm more focused on awareness for our community. If you saw this and you're mentally exhausted, I'll have a fun video linked down below you can watch. If you did enjoy this and you're ready, please do subscribe because I make videos twice a week about all different kink and BDSM related topics, as well as asexuality, relationships, polyamory, dating, and so much more. And finally, if you want to support what I do, the best you can do that is with Patreon. A link to that will be down below. Thank you all so much for supporting me over there. If you already do, it means the absolute world to me. And until I see you all next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.